There is a scene in Family Guy where Peter Griffin stands in front of the United States Congress and defeats the entire federal government with a joke about what the Washington Monument looks like. There is another scene where a 1-year-old baby runs the world from the Oval Office and loses because his mother showed up in a Rambo outfit. There is another scene where the President of the United States and a cartoon man from Rhode Island fall off the Washington Monument and survive because Canada had an air mattress. This is not a coincidence. This is a pattern, and once you see it across every Washington episode Family Guy has ever made, the show stops looking like a dumb cartoon that occasionally makes political jokes, and starts looking like something that has been saying the exact same thing about power for 25 years without ever stopping to explain itself. 10 episodes, 1 argument, 25 years of attacking the same building in different ways. Welcome to Red Umbrella. Subscribe if you want more of this. Now let us begin. Mr. Griffin Goes to Washington, Season 3, Episode 3, 2001. There is a moment in the third season of Family Guy where Peter Griffin stands in front of the United States Congress, microphone in hand, ready to deliver a speech defending the tobacco industry, and he just freezes. Not because he forgot what to say, not because he got nervous. He freezes because he hears his baby son Stewie coughing in the back of the room. A cough caused by the very cigarettes Peter was about to argue were totally fine for kids. And so, Peter Griffin, who was sent to Washington specifically because big corporations needed someone too dumb to ask questions, accidentally becomes the most effective anti-tobacco voice Congress had seen in years. The company that paid him to be their puppet gets fined $100 million and goes bankrupt. Peter drives home. Brian immediately lights up a cigarette. That is Family Guy's first real attack on Washington, and it is a much smarter one than most people remember. The episode is called Mr. Griffin Goes to Washington, and it aired on July 25th, 2001, during the show's third season. The title is a direct reference to a famous 1939 film where an ordinary, honest man goes to Congress and exposes corruption through sheer stubbornness. Family Guy takes that same basic shape and puts Peter Griffin in the middle of it. The result is something that works both as a dumb comedy about a fat man stumbling into politics and as a fairly sharp observation about how Washington actually operates. The show had been on the air for less than 3 full seasons at this point. It was still finding what it wanted to be, and what it chose to do with its first real trip to the Capitol was argue through slapstick and cutaway gags that the people making laws about what Americans can and cannot do are just as easily fooled as anyone else, maybe more so. Here is what happens. Peter works at a toy factory. The factory gets bought by a company called El Dorado Cigarettes. The new bosses start designing toys that are clearly meant to get children interested in smoking. Toys shaped like cigarettes, packaging that targets kids directly. Lois tells Peter he should say something about it. Peter confronts the bosses. The bosses, rather than firing him, promote him to company president. Their logic, stated out loud in a meeting, is that the only way to talk to the idiots in Congress is to send someone just as dumb. Peter is the perfect candidate. He gets a company car, a personal assistant whose entire job is to agree with everything Peter says, and Martha Stewart cleaning his house. The family loves it. Even Lois, who raised the concern in the first place, gets swept up in the perks and goes quiet. This part of the episode is doing something specific. Peter is not the villain here. He is not even really a willing participant in anything corrupt. He's a person who was handed comfort and stopped asking questions the moment life got easier. The show is not cruel about this. It understands it completely. Peter is not uniquely weak or selfish. He is just a person who likes things being good, and things are now good, so he stops pushing. The joke about the company suck-up, whose entire purpose is to tell Peter whatever Peter wants to hear, including that a cloudy day is beautiful and that the Yankees are terrible because Peter hates the Yankees, is one of the funniest minor characters the show ever put on screen. But it is also a precise little portrait of what happens to people when they get access to power. They get surrounded by agreement. They stop correcting course. The suck-up eventually short-circuits trying to hold too many contradictions at once, and his head explodes. It is absurd. It is also correct. El Dorado eventually decides to send Peter to Washington to lobby against a bill that would hurt their business. The way they phrase their selection process in the boardroom is that Congress is full of people who will respond to someone who seems relatable and harmless. Peter fits that description perfectly. He has no agenda beyond not wanting the good times to end. He does not fully understand what he is being asked to do. He is, from the tobacco company's point of view, the ideal representative. What the episode does with Washington itself is interesting. Peter arrives and fits in immediately. He hangs out with senators. He goes to parties. He meets Bob Dole, who endorses his tobacco campaign and then falls asleep mid-sentence repeating his own name. name. The joke about Bob Dole is not especially sophisticated. It is mostly just funny that Bob Dole keeps saying Bob Dole, but the background joke is that this is what Washington looks like from the inside. Sleepy, self-referential, easily impressed by anyone who seems like they belong. Peter belongs because he is big and loud and not asking hard questions. The people making decisions about what gets put in children's toys include a senator who claims cigarettes killed his father and also, separately, assaulted his mother. Congress in this episode is not portrayed as evil. It is portrayed as a place where nobody is quite paying full attention to anything. The Schoolhouse Rock reference, where Peter encounters an anthropomorphic Bill sitting on the steps of the Capitol, like the famous educational cartoon, gets one of the show's better early season gags. The Bill is there doing exactly what the old educational cartoons said bills do, waiting to become a law, earnest and hopeful. Peter ignores it completely. It is a small moment, but it lands. The show grew up watching the same television everyone else did, the same idealistic cartoons about how democracy works, and it has something to say about the distance between that version and the one Peter is currently standing inside. The turn comes because of Stewie. Lois finds Stewie in the house with a cigarette and brings him to Washington to confront Peter. Peter is mid-speech, already halfway through his pro-tobacco talking points, when he looks up and sees his one-year-old son hacking from the cigarette the tobacco company's own marketing put in his hands. The show does not play this for big drama. Peter just stops. He changes his speech on the spot. He tells Congress to reject the proposal. Congress, swayed by nothing more than one man changing his mind in front of them, imposes a fine that bankrupts El Dorado. The company that spent the whole episode using Peter as a tool is undone by the one thing they forgot to account for, which is that Peter actually does care about his family. Not reliably, not consistently, but in the moments that count, the affection is real, and it is stronger than the comfort. Seth MacFarland said on the DVD commentary for this season that when they wrote the scene where Bush and Gore appear in the background, they originally planned to have it predict a Gore election win. MacFarland's words were that they never actually thought Bush could win. The episode aired in July 2001, which meant it was produced roughly a year after the 2000 election. And that small detail tells you something about where the writers were politically and how seriously they were taking Washington as a subject. They were watching it. They had opinions about it. But the show at this stage was not yet willing to make those opinions the point. The political material is embedded inside a comedy about a fat man and a tobacco company. The satire has cover. The ending of the episode, after the main plot wraps up, is a perfect little example of how Family Guy was already developing its specific sense of humor about institutions. Peter addresses the audience directly. The setup makes it seem like he is about to deliver a sincere message about the dangers of smoking, the natural conclusion to an episode about big tobacco. Instead, the message is about the importance of not killing strippers. Strippers are people, Peter says. Naked people who may be willing to do things for a negotiated price behind a curtain, but people nonetheless. The joke lands because the format says something serious is coming, and the show gives you something stupid instead. But there is also something in the selection of the subject. Washington, in this episode, is a place where a real harm, marketing cigarettes to children, gets resolved, and the show immediately points somewhere else, as if to say, one thing at a time. Family Guy would come back to Washington many times after this. The attacks would get louder, more specific, and more personal. The White House would eventually become a battlefield, a throne room, and a punchline all in one. But this first trip established the template that everything after it would build on. The argument is not that politicians are monsters. The argument is that Washington runs on performance, on the appearance of competence and certainty, and that when someone genuinely without a performance shows up, someone who just reacts to what is in front of him, the whole system has no idea how to process it. Peter does not beat the tobacco lobby through strategy. He beats it by accident, through love, and because he happened to look up at the right moment. That is not a flattering portrait of American democracy. It is also not an unflattering one. It is just a very honest one. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And if this first trip to Washington was about a man too dumb to know he was being used, the next time the show turned its attention to the Capitol and the FCC and the monuments that line the National Mall, it would get considerably less polite. Peter's argument in Congress involved a change of heart and a sick baby. The argument the show would make a few seasons later involved 3 specific buildings and a punchline that Congress, according to the episode, had absolutely no response to. Section 2, PTV, Season 4, Episode 14, 2005. There is a specific kind of joke that only works if the audience already knows the joke should not work. Network. Peter Griffin stands in front of the United States Congress, surrounded by senators and representatives, and he points at the Washington Monument. He says it looks like a penis. He points at the Capitol building. He says it looks like a giant breast. He points at the Pentagon. He tells them to look him in the eye and explain how it does not look like a big rear end. Congress goes silent. Then one of the members says out loud, "My God, how could we have been so blind?" And just like that, the most powerful legislative body in the country reverses its position on television censorship because a man from Rhode Island made them look at the buildings they work in every single day. The episode is called PTV. It aired on November 6th, 2005.
During the 4th season of Family Guy. It is probably the most direct attack the show ever made on the relationship between the government and what Americans are allowed to watch, say, and hear. And it does all of it through a song in lingerie, a network run out of a living room, and a punchline about architecture that the show had absolutely no business getting away with. The fact that it did get away with it, and that the episode was nominated for an Emmy Award, tells you something important about what Family Guy understood that a lot of other shows did not. You can say almost anything if you frame it correctly. You can make an argument about free speech and government overreach using nothing but bathroom humor and a cartoon baby in women's clothing. The argument does not become less real because the delivery is absurd. If anything, the absurdity is the point. Here is what actually happened to cause this episode to exist. On February 1st, 2004, during the halftime show of Super Bowl 38, Justin Timberlake pulled at Janet Jackson's costume and part of it came off, briefly exposing her on live television in front of roughly 90 million people. The Federal Communications Commission, which is the government body responsible for regulating what can appear on American broadcast television, received complaints. The number of complaints was, by any reasonable standard, not enormous, but the FCC treated those complaints as if they represented the entire country, and the result was a crackdown on indecency in broadcasting that affected television and radio across America. Fines went up, shows got pressured. The people who ran the FCC decided that what had happened at halftime was a symptom of a broader problem, and that they were the ones to fix it. Seth MacFarlane watched all of this happen and decided to make an episode about it. He confirmed in an interview that PTV was a direct response to the FCC's behavior after the Super Bowl incident. The show had already been in an ongoing war with the Parents Television Council, a conservative watchdog group that had been filing complaints about Family Guy for years and had managed to get at least one episode flagged. The PTV in the episode title is a sarcastic reference to PTC, the Parents Television Council's initials. The episode is Family Guy writing a letter to the people trying to shut it down, and the letter is set to music and features Quagmire naked. The episode begins not with the Janet Jackson incident, but with a version of it. David Hyde Pierce, who played the fussy, uptight character Niles on the long-running sitcom Frasier, has a wardrobe accident during a live awards show. The show is very specific about this. It is not Peter who causes the incident. It is someone already associated with refinement and good taste. His trousers split during the ceremony. The FCC, led in this episode by Cobra Commander from the cartoon G.I. Joe, a character whose entire purpose in his original show was to yell orders and be defeated, receives a small number of phone calls. The episode makes the math visible. The FCC treats 20 calls as representing 20 billion people, which is roughly 3 times the population of the entire planet. Cobra Commander decides this constitutes a national crisis. The crackdown begins. Peter is furious. He loves television. He loves the unfiltered, uncensored version of television that he remembers from his childhood. The version where things were rough and real, and nobody put a bar over anything. A friend suggests he start his own network, so Peter does. He builds PTV out of his living room and broadcasts old shows in their original, unedited form. He also creates original programming, including a show called The Peter Griffin Side Boob Hour and a show called Dogs Humping. Brian and Stewie join him and make their own show together, a sitcom called Cheeky Bastard that includes a laugh track that Stewie provides himself. The network is a massive success. Everyone in Quahog loves it. Lois hates it. This is an important part of the episode that sometimes gets forgotten in the broader reading of PTV as a straightforward free speech argument. Lois is not a villain in this episode. She is not stupid or wrong to be concerned. She looks at what is on PTV and genuinely worries about what her children are absorbing. She watches Peter broadcast increasingly extreme content, and she thinks about Chris and Meg sitting in front of the screen, taking it all in. Brian makes the counter argument clearly. Parents are the ones responsible for what their kids watch, not
not the government. He says there are worse influences in the world than what appears on television. Lois does not accept this. She calls the FCC. What happens next is where the episode becomes genuinely interesting. The FCC shuts PTV down. That part is expected. What is not expected is that Peter tells the FCC agents, as they are leaving, that they can shut down the network, but they cannot stop people from being who they are. The FCC takes this as a challenge. They decide to censor not just television, but life itself in the town of Quahog. FCC agents follow Peter everywhere. Every time he tries to say something inappropriate, an air horn sounds. A black censorship bar is physically pulled in front of his body when he steps out of the shower. Public flatulence becomes illegal. The agents stand outside Peter and Lois's bedroom and interrupt them every time their behavior becomes anything other than completely still and silent. Lois, who called the FCC in the first place, is now unable to have a normal conversation with her own husband or live a normal life in her own home. This is the episode's actual argument. Not that indecency is fine, not that parents should not care what their kids watch. The argument is that the alternative to some messiness is government agents in your bedroom telling you to stop moving. The argument is that once you invite that level of control in through the front door, it does not stop at the front door. Lois learns this the hard way. She goes from being someone who wanted the FCC to clean up Peter's network to being someone who cannot have a private moment in her own house. She and Peter drive to Washington together. The musical number that happens before the Washington trip is the moment most people remember from this episode. Peter, Brian, and Stewie perform an elaborate song in matching outfits about the FCC's regulations. The song is called The Freaking FCC, and it is exactly what it sounds like. 3 minutes of Family Guy spelling out, in melody, exactly how ridiculous it finds government censorship. The three of them wear matching lingerie during parts of it. The FCC agents who arrive to watch the performance are genuinely impressed. They still shut PTV down. The song does not work as a legal argument. It works as a statement of how the show feels. Seth MacFarlane said in interviews that the opening sequence of the episode, which shows Stewie on his tricycle riding through scenes from famous movies before running over Homer Simpson from The Simpsons, was added after the producers discovered the episode ran 3 minutes short. That sequence has nothing to do with the FCC plot. It is just Family Guy doing whatever it wants, which is, of course, the entire point of the episode. The trip to Congress is where the Washington attack actually lands. Peter and Lois walk in. Congress announces that it supports the FCC and that indecency is un-American. Peter says he can prove that claim is a mistake. He does not do this through a speech or an argument or any appeal to the First Amendment. He points at the buildings. The Washington Monument, which has stood in the center of the National Mall since 1884, and which every member of Congress walks past on a regular basis, looks, Peter says, an awful lot like a certain part of the male body.
The Capitol building, where these conversations about decency are happening, is quite obviously shaped like a giant breast. And the Pentagon, which houses the Department of Defense and is one of the most recognizable buildings in the world, looks like something else entirely. Congress realizes they have never thought about this before. They immediately change course. The joke works on 2 levels at once. On the surface, it is ridiculous. Congress reversing a major policy position because of building shapes is not how any of this works. But the underlying point is real. The people making moral judgments about what is and is not decent in American culture do so from inside buildings that, if you look at them without the weight of familiarity, are not exactly tasteful. The show is not saying that the buildings are inappropriate. It is saying that decency and indecency are not fixed, objective categories. They depend entirely on what you have decided to look at and what you have decided to look away from. Congress had simply never looked at the Washington Monument the same way Peter was looking at it. Once they did, the argument for censorship collapsed. The episode was nominated for an Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program. The Simpsons won that year. Family Guy did not. But the nomination matters for what it says about how the industry received the episode. This was not a throwaway political joke built around a single cutaway. PTV was recognized as a complete, well-constructed piece of television that made a real argument using comedy as its delivery system. The Parents Television Council, which the episode was partly a response to, continued its war against Family Guy for years afterward. The show continued not to care. What PTV established, more clearly than anything in Season 3, is the specific flavor of Family Guy's political anger. It is not the careful, measured anger of a show trying to appear balanced. It is the anger of a show that genuinely believes the people in charge of deciding what is appropriate have too much power and not enough self-awareness.
arguments, and that the best way to demonstrate this is to make them look stupid in a way they cannot argue with. You cannot respond to the Washington Monument joke. There is no dignified counterargument. Congress has no comeback. That is exactly the kind of corner Family Guy wanted to paint its targets into, the kind you cannot talk your way out of. Peter and Lois win. Life in Quahog returns to normal. The family sits down to watch an episode of The Brady Bunch that prominently features toilet humor. The FCC has been defeated. Indecency, the show seems to say, was never actually the problem. The problem was always the idea that someone else got to define it for you.
Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously.
But the show was not finished with Washington yet, not even close. The next time Family Guy sent a character to the White House, it was not to lobby anyone or argue about television. It was to take over the entire planet. And the person doing the taking over was 1 year old. Section 3. Stewie kills Lois / Lois kills Stewie. Season 6, episode 4-5, 2007. There is a news recap at the beginning of the second part of this two-parter that is delivered entirely by Ollie Williams, the show's weatherman character who communicates exclusively in short, loud bursts. Tom Tucker throws to him and asks what happened in the previous episode. Ollie Williams says, at full volume, "Stewie killed Lois." Then, Peter got blamed. Then, Peter went to court. Then, Lois came back. Then, wasn't really dead. Tom Tucker thanks him, and the episode begins. It is maybe 15 seconds of television. It recaps a 45-minute story in 5 sentences. And then the second episode picks up exactly where it left off, with Stewie Griffin, a 1-year-old baby in a red onesie, on the run from the law, headed to Washington, D.C., planning to take over the world and broadcast his new laws from the Oval Office. This is the 100th episode of Family Guy. The two-part story aired on November 4th and November 11th, 2007, during the show's 6th season. The episodes were originally produced for the end of Season 5, but held back and aired as the Season 6 opener. Seth MacFarlane had said publicly before the episodes aired that the 100th episode of Family Guy would involve a death. The title of the first episode told you exactly who died. The show was not hiding what it was doing, and yet the execution of it, the way the two episodes move from a cruise ship shooting to a courtroom to a worldwide takeover to the Oval Office, manages to feel genuinely surprising at almost every step, which is not easy for a show that had spent 5 seasons training its audience to expect the rug to get pulled. Here is how it starts. Peter and Lois go on a cruise to celebrate Lois's birthday. Stewie is not invited. He is left at home with Brian and the other kids. Stewie is furious about this. Brian, in an attempt to settle him down, essentially dares him. He tells Stewie that for all his talk about wanting to kill Lois, he never actually does it. He says Stewie will never go through with it. This is the worst possible thing Brian could have said to Stewie Griffin. Stewie stows away on the cruise ship, finds Lois alone on the deck at night, shoots her point blank, and she goes overboard into the ocean. A year passes. Peter is charged with Lois's murder. The trial plays out. Peter is about to be convicted. Then Lois walks into the courtroom, very much alive, and points at Stewie as the person who shot her. Nobody in the room can quite process this. Stewie, realizing the situation has changed dramatically, escapes. Part 2 begins with Stewie back at the Griffin house, waiting for the family with a gun. He ties them up. He tells Brian to drive him to CIA headquarters. At CIA headquarters, Stewie and Brian disguise themselves as agents and walk in. Stewie hacks into the CIA's main computer and seizes control of the entire planet's power grid. Stan Smith and Avery Bullock, who are regular characters on the show American Dad, which also airs on Fox and also involves a spy organization, show up and try to stop him. They cannot. Stewie demonstrates what he can do with the power grid, and they give up. They agree to his demands. Stewie becomes president of the world. He moves into the White House and starts broadcasting his new rules. The list of Stewie's presidential laws is worth going through because it tells you a lot about what the show thinks a baby with total power would actually prioritize. He bans direct-to-video Disney sequels, which were a well-known running joke at the time about cheap, low-quality follow-ups to beloved movies. He announces that Hilary Swank will be responsible for supplying the world's milk. He instates grammar laws that send anyone who uses the words irregardless, a whole nother, or all of the sudden to a work camp. That last one is specific enough to feel like it was written by someone who had been personally bothered by grammatical errors for a long time and finally had a platform to address them. Stewie is not a politician. He is a baby with a grudge list, and now he has a microphone. The White House functions in these episodes as Stewie's throne. The Oval Office is not treated with any reverence. It is simply the room with the most cameras, the room where you go when you want to tell everyone what the rules are now. Stewie sits behind the desk and issues commands. The show does not linger on how strange it is that a 1-year-old baby is running the world from the most recognizable office on Earth. It just keeps moving, which is part of why it works. The absurdity has momentum. You do not get time to question it because the next thing is already happening. Lois gets back to Quahog, hears Stewie's broadcast, and decides she has to stop him. She goes to Stewie's room and opens his weapons vault, which has been there the whole time, hidden under the floor. She pulls out guns, body armor, and combat gear. Then she tells Peter that dinner is in the oven and she will be back later. That detail, dinner is in the oven, is one of the funniest and most precisely written lines in either episode. Lois is about to go fight her baby for control of the planet. She has still made sure someone fed Peter. The domestic and the apocalyptic exist in the same sentence without any acknowledgement that this is unusual. The show gives Lois a specific outfit for the fight. She shows up at the White House dressed in the combat gear worn by John Rambo in the third Rambo movie, released in 1988. She crashes through the window of the Oval Office. Stewie is sitting behind the presidential desk. They face each other. Both are armed with enough weapons to destroy a small country. What follows is described by the show's own episode reviews as extended and highly choreographed. A full action sequence between a grown woman and a 1-year-old baby that the show plays completely straight, with no winking at the camera about how insane this is. The fight goes back and forth. Lois gets the upper hand. She has Stewie at gunpoint. And then the episode does something unexpected. Stewie, cornered and about to be shot by his own mother, taunts her. He tells her to do it. And Lois, who has just fought through an entire action sequence and taken down the president of the world, cannot pull the trigger. Not because she is weak, because he is still her baby. Even after everything he has done, shooting her, framing Peter, seizing the power grid, issuing grammar work camps, she looks at him and sees her child. She drops the gun. She surrenders. Stewie picks up the gun and points it at her. Then Peter walks in and shoots Stewie twice, once in the chest, once in the head. The show does not soften this. Peter shoots his own son dead. He and Lois stand over Stewie's body. They hold each other. The scene is played without a joke. There is genuine grief in it, even though Stewie has spent the entire 2-part story trying to kill Lois and take over the planet. He is still their child. The silence in that moment is the most un-Family Guy moment Family Guy had produced up to that point. Then the screen shows the words, "Simulation over." The camera pulls back to reveal Stewie sitting in a chair-like device in his room. Brian walks in with postcards from Peter and Lois, who are apparently still on the cruise, having a perfectly nice time. Brian gives Stewie the postcards. Stewie explains that everything the audience just watched, both full episodes, all 45 minutes, the shooting and the trial and the CIA and the White House and the fight and Peter killing him, was a computer simulation Stewie ran to see how his plan to kill Lois would work out. Brian had told him at the start that he would never go through with it, so Stewie built a simulation to prove he could. The simulation showed him that it would not go well. Stewie looks at Brian and says, quietly, that things did not work out so well in the simulation. His plans to kill Lois and take over the world will have to wait, for now. Then Brian and Stewie have a short conversation about how someone watching this as a television show might feel upset that none of it was real. Stewie says it would be like a big middle finger to the fans. He starts to say something else, and the screen cuts to black mid-sentence. The joke is a reference to the final episode of The Sopranos, which had aired earlier that same year and ended on an abrupt cut to black that divided audiences sharply. Family Guy watched that ending and decided to do the same thing, except Stewie explicitly tells you that is what they are doing right before it happens. The episodes were reviewed very well. IGN rated the first part a 9 out of 10, and the second part a 9.4 out of 10. The reviewer said the show had finally delivered on one of its longest-running promises, Stewie actually following through on his threat to kill Lois, and that the balance between comedy and real storytelling was the best the show had managed since its early seasons. Both episodes ranked on BBC Three's list of the top 10 Family Guy episodes. The cliffhanger at the end of the first episode, where Lois walks into the courtroom alive, was written as a deliberate reference to the Star Trek The Next Generation 2-part episode, The Best of Both Worlds, which is considered one of the great cliffhangers in television history. McFarland and writer David Goodman had wanted to use the actual music from that Star Trek episode. Paramount would not give them the rights, so they hired Ron Jones, who had composed the original music for The Best of Both Worlds, to write new music in the same style specifically for this episode. There are small details throughout both episodes that reward attention. When Stewie is holding the family hostage and waiting for Brian to come back, he demands that Chris acknowledge how good his macaroni picture of an owl is. Chris, terrified, says it is great. Stewie says, no, it is not great. It is good, and the difference matters. This is a 1-year-old baby who just shot his mother, framed his father for murder, and is planning to seize control of the CIA, stopping to seek specific and accurate feedback on a craft project. The joke is funny on the surface. Underneath it is a portrait of a character who wants to be taken seriously more than he wants almost anything else, including world domination. The power is almost secondary. The need to be seen is primary. The White House scenes specifically are important to what the show is doing with this story. By the time Stewie gets to the Oval Office, he has already done everything that required actual difficulty. The CIA hack, the power grid seizure, the political negotiation. The White House is just where you go after all that work. It is the symbol, not the substance. The show understands this. Washington is not where the real control happens. The real control happened in a computer room. The White House is just the address you use when you want to make announcements. Stewie sits behind that desk not because it gives him power, but because it tells everyone else that he has it. And then a woman crashes through the window in Rambo gear and the whole thing falls apart. The simulation framing is what makes these episodes genuinely interesting rather than just a stunt. The show is not actually killing Lois. It is not actually letting Stewie win. It is letting you watch what would happen if both of those things were true, and then showing you the moment Stewie decides it is not worth it. Not because he cannot do it, because the simulation showed him what winning looks like. And winning looks like Peter Griffin walking in and shooting him in the head while his mother watches. Stewie wanted to take over the world from the White House. He ran the math. He decided to wait. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That restraint would not last, of course. The show was about to start paying much closer attention to Washington in a different way. Not through a baby with a power grid, but through a road trip that ended with a monument nobody had thought to put next to the Washington Monument before, and a punchline so specific it could only have come from a writer's room that had been watching the news very carefully. Section 4. The Splendid Source. S8E19, 2010. There is a moment in this episode where Peter, Joe, Cleveland, and Quagmire arrive in Washington, D.C.
on their road trip, and the camera cuts to a wide shot of the National Mall. The Washington Monument is standing where it always stands, tall and white and familiar. Right next to it is another monument. This one is taller. This one is painted black. A small label on screen identifies it as the Barack Obama Monument. It has the exact same shape as the Washington Monument. It is simply bigger and a different color. The show holds the shot just long enough for you to register what you were looking at, and then the story moves on without comment. That is the entire joke. The show does not explain it. Nobody in the episode says anything about it. It is just there, next to the real monument, completely matter-of-fact, as if it has always been there and always will be. The episode is called The Splendid Source, and it aired during Family Guy's 8th season. The main story is built around a single question. Where did the world's dirty jokes originally come from? Not a specific dirty joke, all of them. Every crude, off-color, inappropriate joke that has ever been told by anyone, anywhere. The show wants to know who made the first one and where the tradition started. Peter hears a dirty joke at a bar that he cannot figure out the origin of, and this bothers him enough that he convinces Joe, Cleveland, and Quagmire to help him trace it back to its source. The road trip takes them from Quahog to Virginia to Washington, D.C., and eventually to a private island that functions like a military compound, where they discover that the world's dirty jokes have been written since the beginning of human history by a small group of the planet's greatest minds. Before getting into what the show does with Washington in this episode, it is worth understanding why the episode existed at all. This was Season 8, which aired in 2009 and 2010. Cleveland Brown had just left Family Guy to star in his own spin-off show called The Cleveland Show, which had premiered in the fall of 2009. The Splendid Source was the first time Cleveland appeared back on Family Guy after leaving for his own series, and the episode was also the first official crossover between the two shows. Characters from The Cleveland Show appeared alongside the Family Guy regulars. The actor who voiced Cleveland, Mike Henry, had left the main cast of Family Guy to focus on the spin-off, and his return here was treated as a significant moment. The episode had been announced at San Diego Comic-Con in 2009, months before it aired, which was unusual for a single Family Guy episode. The road trip structure is one Family Guy had used before and would use again, getting Peter and some combination of his friends out of Quahog and into
into the wider world, where the show could comment on things beyond the immediate neighborhood. The Splendid Source uses this structure more deliberately than most road trip episodes. The guys are not traveling for vacation or by accident. They are on a genuine mission to answer a question, and the show treats that mission with a straight face, even as everything around it gets increasingly strange. The Washington, D.C. stop is not the climax of the road trip, but it is the most memorable single moment. The guys arrive in the city, and the camera shows them standing in front of the National Mall, taking in the monuments. What they are actually seeing is the combination of the real Washington Monument and the fictional Obama Monument placed right next to it. The joke is doing several things at once. On the most basic level, it is playing with the idea of presidential legacy. The Washington Monument is one of the most famous monuments in the world, built to honor the first president, and the joke is that the newly elected president already has an equivalent monument right next to it. Barack Obama had been elected in November 2008 and inaugurated in January 2009. This episode aired in 2010,
meaning Obama had been president for roughly a year when it was written and produced.
The joke is not mean-spirited. It is more observational than anything. Here is a president who inspired an enormous amount of national feeling, and this is what the show does with that feeling, which is make a monument joke. The specific details of the joke matter. The Obama monument is not just bigger, it is taller in a way that makes the Washington monument look modest by comparison. And the color difference is noted without any additional commentary. The show puts both monuments on screen, labels one, and moves on. It trusts the audience to process it. This is Family Guy at its most restrained, which is a strange thing to say about a punchline involving the shape of national monuments, but compared to the show's usual approach to political comedy, which involves full episodes and extended brawl sequences, a single wide shot with a label is almost subtle. The road trip itself eventually leads the guys to a man named Sal Russo, a bellhop in a Washington, D.C. hotel, who tells them where he first heard the joke. This sends them out of the city and onto the next leg of the trip, which involves being chased by men in a black car who are trying to stop them from learning the truth, and eventually landing on the secret island compound where Warren Buffett, Bill Gates, and Stephen Hawking are sitting around writing jokes. The show reveals that the first dirty joke ever told was written in ancient Egypt. The tradition has continued unbroken ever since, maintained by the world's smartest people in their spare time, because apparently the construction of off-color humor is one of the things genius minds do when they are not inventing things or making money. The island reveal is the episode's big comedic swing, and it mostly works because the show commits to it completely. Buffett, Gates, and Hawking are not there as cameos or winking references. They are presented as the custodians of the world's crude humor, taking their responsibility seriously, producing content that trickles down through society without anyone ever knowing the source. It is an absurd premise handled with total earnestness, which is the specific register Family Guy does best. But it is the Washington, D.C. sequence that matters most to the larger story this video essay is telling, because the Splendid Source represents a different relationship between Family Guy and Washington than the episodes before it. Mr. Griffin Goes to Washington and PTV both sent characters to Washington with a purpose. They had something to do there, a problem to solve, a fight to win. Stewie took over the world and ran it from the White House. All of those episodes used Washington as an arena. The Splendid Source uses Washington as scenery. The guys pass through. They stop. The camera catches the monuments. One of those monuments is new. The show keeps driving. This is a more casual kind of attack. There is no confrontation with Congress. Nobody crashes through the Oval Office window. The joke about the Obama monument is not angry or bitter or politically charged in the way the FCC episode was charged. It is just a joke sitting inside a landscape, waiting to be noticed. The show is so comfortable making fun of Washington at this point, season 8, nearly a decade into its run, multiple trips to the Capitol already on its record, that it does not need to build a whole episode around the punchline. It can drop one into a wide shot and keep moving. The episode received generally positive reviews when it aired. Critics praised it specifically for being less dependent on random cutaway gags than the show had been in recent seasons. One reviewer noted that the episode forcing smarter writing and a better story structure by reducing the cutaways. The road trip format gave the episode a spine that a lot of Family Guy episodes from this era lacked.
You knew where the characters were going, you cared whether they would get there, and the jokes along the way had a context to land in. The Obama monument joke works partly because it arrives in the middle of a story that is actually moving somewhere. It is not a detached comment dropped into empty space. It is a specific stop on a specific road. The Cleveland crossover element also matters here. Cleveland had left Quahog and built a new life, and his return to the group for this road trip is treated with genuine warmth. The guys are happy to have him. The episode is not pretending that his absence has not happened. It acknowledges that things changed and that this particular
adventure brought the old group back together. That emotional undercurrent gives the road trip a texture that purely joke-focused episodes often lack. One other thing is worth noting about the splendid source in the context of Family Guy's relationship with Washington. The show was in a specific place in American history. Obama had been elected on an enormous wave of national feeling, and the cultural response to his election was still very fresh. The show was not yet in the era of deep partisan conflict that would define the Trump years and produce the Trump two-parter episodes later. The Washington of the splendid source is not a battleground, it is a backdrop. The monument joke acknowledges the president without attacking him, without defending him, without doing much beyond pointing at his name and moving on. For a show that had made a sport of going to war with Washington's institutions, this is relatively gentle. The joke also works because the Washington Monument is the joke, not Obama specifically. The monument, its shape, its size, its position at the center of the National Mall as the most recognizable symbol of American presidential legacy, is the material. The show is not saying anything about Obama's presidency. It is saying something about the monument,
which is that it stands in one of the most visited public spaces in America and has a very specific silhouette, and that putting a taller, darker version of it right next to it is funny because of what the monument looks like, not because of what the Obama monument is supposed to represent. The layering is quick enough that you might miss it, but it is there. After the splendid source, Family Guy would continue to treat Washington as a place you could drop a punchline into and keep walking. The casual confidence of that Obama monument shot, no setup, no follow-through, just a label and a cut, would show up again in future seasons in the form of cutaway gags, background jokes, and offhand references to whoever was in the Oval Office at the time. Washington had become fully domesticated as a target. The show no longer needed a whole episode to take a swing at it. A wide shot was enough.
Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously.
But that casualness was about to get interrupted. The next episode in this story is not a road trip or a background joke. It is a full-length anthology episode built around 3 different Hollywood directors, one of whom would use the White House as the setting for a war council, fill it with Decepticons, and put the fate of the 7 wonders of the world in the hands of a man whose only qualification is that he is very good at throwing beer kegs. And the president presiding over that White House war council would be someone no one in real life had ever actually elected. Section 5. 3 directors. S16E5, 2017. There is a moment in the Michael Bay portion of this episode where the camera cuts to the White House, and a general standing in a war room tells a room full of military personnel that the Decepticons, giant alien robots from the Transformers movies, are attacking the 7 wonders of the world. The general explains that scientists have determined the only way to destroy a Decepticon is to throw a full beer keg directly into the center of its body. The room falls silent. Everyone in that war room, in that White House, in that seat of American power, has to sit with the fact that their entire military, every weapon, every soldier, every piece of equipment paid for by the American taxpayer is useless against this threat. The only thing that can save the world is a fat man from Rhode Island who is very good at throwing beer kegs. Carter Pewterschmidt, Lois's enormously wealthy father, is dispatched to recruit Peter for the mission. Peter accepts. He assembles his team. The world is saved. The episode is called 3 Directors, and it aired on November 5th, 2017, during Family Guy's 16th season. The premise is an anthology. The same basic story, Peter getting fired from the Pawtucket Brewery, told 3 separate times in the style of 3 different famous Hollywood directors. The 3 directors are Quentin Tarantino, Wes Anderson, and Michael Bay. Each segment has its own look, its own tone, its own set of references, and its own version of Peter. The Tarantino segment is violent and stylized and full of pop music. The Wes Anderson segment is narrated by Stewie, shot in a careful, symmetrical style, and ends with Peter dying and coming back in a way that nobody in the story seems very surprised about. The Michael Bay segment is where the White House appears, and it is the segment most relevant to the larger story of how Family Guy treats Washington. Before getting into what the episode does, it is worth understanding what made this particular episode carry more weight than a standard Family Guy anthology. 2 of its guest voices were Carrie Fisher and Adam West, both of whom had been part of the show for years. Carrie Fisher had voiced Peter's boss Angela since the early seasons. Adam West had voiced the mayor of Quahog, a character named Mayor Adam West, since the show began. Both Fisher and West died in 2017. Carrie Fisher passed away on December 28, 2016. Adam West passed away on June 9, 2017. 3 Directors aired on November 5, 2017, which means it aired after both of them were gone. Their voices are in the episode. You can hear them. The episode did not announce this or make a a big moment of it. It just aired, and their voices were there, and that was that. The Quentin Tarantino segment opens with a version of Peter, dressed in a black suit, driving a car with a cracked windshield, listening to a rock band called Ides of March. The segment is a blend of references to several Tarantino films, primarily Pulp Fiction and the Kill Bill movies. Peter arrives at the brewery, gets fired, grabs a glowing golden beer keg on his way out, gets shot at his house by his boss Angela, who has become a Uma Thurman-style villain, wakes up in a hospital, escapes, goes home to find a special combat outfit and sword, fights his way through a group of characters, all played by the show's recurring Asian reporter Trisha Takanawa, and finally confronts Angela. The segment ends with Peter opening the golden keg and staring into it as the credits roll, just like the famous briefcase scene in Pulp Fiction, where the contents are never shown. The Tarantino segment is the most visually aggressive of the three. It is also the one most interested in its own references, which is both its strength and its weakness. The jokes work if you know the films, and land flat if you do not. The segment knows this, and moves fast enough that the flat moments do not linger. The Wes Anderson segment is narrated by Stewie in the dry, slightly sad voice that Wes Anderson movies tend to use for their narration. It is set around the turn of the century, the early 1900s, and Peter is fired just before the opening of a play he has been working on. The segment uses the very specific visual style Anderson is known for, where characters are centered perfectly in the frame, colors are muted and carefully chosen, and everything feels slightly too neat to be real. There is a German language version of the song I Got You Babe playing at one point. The segment ends with a note that Peter would die at age 43 from chasing a Pokemon across the street. The Pokemon detail is pure Family Guy inserted into a Wes Anderson wrapper, and the combination is strange enough to be funny. Then comes Michael Bay. The Michael Bay segment is visually completely different from the other two. Everything is big. Everything is bright. The color is saturated to the point of almost hurting to look at. The camera moves constantly, spinning around characters during conversations that do not require a spinning camera. Peter in this segment is physically transformed. He is muscular and sweaty and competent in a way that normal Peter never is, loading trucks with precision keg throwing and accomplishing in seconds what would take most people much longer. Angela in this segment is dressed like the actress Megan Fox was dressed in the Transformers movies, meaning she is glamorous in a way that has nothing to do with her actual job at the brewery. She fires Peter after he destroys a keg by punching it open with his bare fist to drink from it. Then the Decepticons attack. The White House War Council is presented exactly as war councils are presented in Michael Bay's Transformers films. Generals, maps, urgent voices, a global threat requiring immediate response. The camera swoops around the room. Flags are visible in the background. The language is full of military terms delivered at high speed. This is the visual grammar of American power as Michael Bay understands it, which means it is enormous and loud and takes itself completely seriously, while also being kind of impossible to follow. The show is parodying this very specifically. The War Council in the actual Transformers films always has a slightly absurd quality. Generals discussing robots from space as if they are a routine military problem, and the Family Guy version amplifies that absurdity by making the solution to the Decepticon threat a man who throws beer kegs. The president presiding over this White House, as mentioned in the episode, is Mayor Adam West. This requires a small explanation. In the world of Family Guy, the mayor of Quahog has always been a character called Mayor Adam West, voiced by Adam West himself. The character is based on and named after the actor, who was famous for playing Batman in the 1960s television series. Mayor Adam West is an eccentric, unpredictable character who does things like declare war on the word taxes because he hears the word too many times. In the Three Directors episode, the Michael Bay segment simply extends his authority from mayor of a fictional Rhode Island town to President of the United States without comment or explanation. He is the president because this is a Michael Bay movie, and in Michael Bay movies, the president is a serious authority figure, and Mayor Adam West is the most serious authority figure the Family Guy universe has. It is also, in retrospect, a small tribute, letting Adam West be the president of the United States in the last major episode he appeared in before his death. Peter goes off on the mission. He visits his ex-wife Lois. In the Michael Bay version of events, they are divorced, and she has started a relationship with Brian, to say goodbye to his children before heading into danger. Chris and Stewie both mention specific wonders of the world they hope Peter will save. Peter flies with Quagmire, Cleveland, and Joe to Istanbul, where they encounter 3 Decepticons. A fight sequence follows,
follows, cut together in the rapid, hard-to-follow style that Michael Bay's action sequences are famous for. The song that plays during the fight is Burn It Down by Linkin Park. The rock band, Chester Bennington, the lead singer of Linkin Park, had died on July 20th, 2017, 4 GK months before this episode aired. The episode used the song without pulling back from it. Like the Adam West and Carrie Fisher voices, it was simply there. The episode did not announce just played the song. Peter defeats the final Decepticon by throwing a beer keg directly into its chest. He appears to die in the explosion. A memorial service is held. A statue of Peter is UK bailed. Then Peter appears, alive, having been, as the episode UK bit, welded back together by his friends who kept his survival a secret. In the closing scene, Peter and Lois go behind a tombstone at the memorial to have a private moment, and it becomes clear that Peter cannot actually perform as expected. He and Lois just talk for a few minutes. Peter plans to GK back and tell everyone it went fine. At the very end of the episode, after all 3 segments, Peter asks Lois which director version was her favorite. Lois says, honestly, she did not care for the episode at all. The show breaks its own structure in the last 30 seconds, GKB to have a character deliver what amounts GK Family Guy, making the last joke at its own expense, acknowledging that the whole thing might not have worked, and then ending anyway. The episode scored a 7.8 out of 10 on IMDb, which for later era Family Guy represents a positive reception. Reviews noted that the 3-segment structure kept the episode focused in a way that typical episodes sometimes were not. The IndieWire review described the episode as a missed opportunity, while still acknowledging that several specific moments, particularly the Wes and B details, showed genuine craft. The Bubble Blabber review noted that unlike some recent episodes that had become scattered collections of unrelated references, GK 3 directors stayed organized because the parody structure gave it a shape to hold on to. The White House scene specifically is not the most discussed part of this episode. It is a small piece of the Michael Bay segment, a brief stop before Carter recruits Peter and the mission begins. But it represents something consistent in Family Guy's approach to Washington that had been present since season 3. Every time the show sends a character to the White House, or to Congress, or to the National Mall, it is making an argument about power. Sometimes that argument is about who holds power and whether they deserve it. Sometimes it is about what power looks like from outside, how it presents itself, how it demands to be taken seriously. In the Michael Bay segment, the White House is a room where very serious-looking people discover that all their power is completely useless, and the only solution is someone they would never normally call. That is not a new argument for Family Guy. It is the same argument Peter made in front of Congress in season 3, and the same argument Stewie made when he bypassed every government agency and just hacked the CIA's computer himself. Washington looks powerful. When it matters most, it turns to Peter Griffin. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The episode aired in November 2017. It was 16 seasons in. The show had been making fun of Washington for nearly 2 decades at that point, and it was about to do it more directly, more personally, and more angrily than it ever had before. Because something had happened in November 2016 that the writers had not expected, had not prepared for, and could not quite believe. And they had been working on a response to it for over a year. That response would involve 2 full episodes, a fight across multiple Washington landmarks, a Jabba the Hutt reference, and Justin Trudeau arriving with an industrial air mattress.
Section 6, Hefty Shades of Grey, S17E10, 2019. There is a moment near the very end of this episode where Peter Griffin has just agreed to stop spreading fake news. He has admitted to Lois that it does not feel good lying all the time. He says maybe she is right. He says he will stop. Lois looks relieved. The conversation feels like it is wrapping up the way these conversations usually wrap up on Family Guy. Peter does something wrong. Peter admits it. The episode closes. Then Peter's phone rings. He answers it. The voice on the other end tells him it has seen what he has been doing on the news, and it loves it. The voice asks if Peter would like to come to Washington and be the White House press secretary. Peter says yes immediately. Lois rips his head clean off his body. His headless body stands there for a second. Then the words, "To be continued," appear on screen. That is how Family Guy set up its biggest attack on Washington in the show's entire run. Not with a dramatic cold open or a serious statement about the state of American politics, with Peter's head getting ripped off and a cliffhanger. The episode is called Hefty Shades of Grey, and it aired on January 6th, 2019 as the 10th episode of Family Guy's 17th season. The title is a reference to the novel 50 Shades of Grey, which was a massively popular adult romance
romance novel. The connection between that title and the actual content of the episode is that Peter's hair turns gray, and the joke is that the word hefty is standing in for 50 because Peter is a large man. That is the full extent of the connection. The rest of the episode has nothing to do with romance novels. The episode begins with Peter, Joe, Cleveland, and Quagmire using an app called Zillow, which is a real website that shows how much houses in any neighborhood are worth. Joe introduces the guys to the app, and everyone starts checking their home values.
Peter looks up his own house and discovers it is worth significantly less than the other houses on the street. He investigates and finds out that the previous owner of his house, a woman named Doris Billingsley, was murdered on the property. This is why the house was cheap when the Griffins bought it. Cleveland, hearing this, suggests that the ghost of Doris Billingsley might still be haunting the house. The guys decide to go ghost hunting in Peter's basement. The ghost hunt goes nowhere. The guys get bored and tired of Peter messing around instead of taking it seriously. Eventually, Quagmire, frustrated with Peter, turns off the basement lights, slams the door, and locks Peter inside. He, Joe, and Cleveland leave. The rest of the Griffin family is asleep and cannot hear Peter shouting. Peter spends the entire night trapped alone in his dark basement, terrified. The one person who hears him is Meg, who comes downstairs at some point, realizes her father is locked in the basement, screaming for help, and leaves him there. Given the way Peter has treated Meg across the entire show's run, the episode does not frame this as cruel. It frames it as completely reasonable. The next morning, Lois finds Peter collapsed on the floor of the basement. When he comes out into the light, his hair has turned completely white. He spent one night scared and alone, and his hair went fully gray from the stress of it. The show does not explain the science of this. It does not need to. Peter has white hair now. That is the premise. What happens next is the part of the episode that matters most for understanding why it exists and where it leads. People start treating Peter differently the moment they see his white hair. Strangers trust him. Neighbors respect him. He walks into a room and people assume he is wise and experienced and worth listening to. Nothing about Peter has changed except the color of his hair, but white hair reads to the people around him as authority. Tom Tucker, the local news anchor on Quahog's Channel 5 News, notices this reaction and recruits Peter to come on the show as an on-air commentator. Tucker explains the logic to Peter directly. People want to know that bad things are happening out there. Peter, with his white hair, looks like someone who would know about bad things. Tucker encourages Peter to say alarming things, because alarming things get ratings. Peter, who has never needed much encouragement to say whatever comes into his head, starts delivering rants on the local news. One of them is about immigration. Peter says on air that crime is way up, and the reason is immigrants, and that Americans should take a pledge to kick them out. The rant plays in the episode without a laugh track or a cutaway softening it. Lois watches it at home and is horrified. She confronts Peter and tells him that fake news is a real problem in the country, and she does not want him contributing to it. Peter, to his credit, hears her. He agrees. He says it does not feel good lying all the time, and that is when the phone rings. The episode was written by a writer named Mike Desilets and directed by Joseph Lee. It aired in January 2019 as part of a 2-episode arc, with the second episode, Trump Guy, airing the following week on January 13th. The 2 episodes together were conceived and produced as a single connected story. Executive producer Rich Apple explained in an interview how the arc came together. The story originally started as just the fake news episode, with Peter becoming a fear-mongering pundit. While the writers were developing that story, they realized that someone in the real White House would appreciate exactly what Peter was doing. That realization became the second episode. The 2-parter grew out of one idea producing another, which is how Family Guy's best multi-part stories tend to develop. Executive producer Alex Sulkin spoke separately to the entertainment website TV Line about the timing of the Trump episode and how the writers handled the gap between when they wrote the material and when it aired. Animated shows take a long time to produce. An episode written in early 2018 would not air until January 2019. Sulkin said that Trump had been very consistent, which helped. He said that Trump was always in the news for doing the same things, and that this consistency made the episode feel current, even though it had been written many months earlier. The observation underneath that comment is worth sitting with. Sulkin was essentially saying that the president's behavior was so predictable, so unchanging, that a satirical episode written about him a year before it aired would still feel accurate when it finally reached audiences. The Hefty Shades of Grey episode is doing something specific that often gets overlooked because it is the quieter half of the 2-parter. It is building the argument for why Peter Griffin, specifically, would end up in the Trump White House. The argument is not that Peter is evil or corrupt. The argument is that Peter succeeds in the fake news environment for the same reason
El Dorado cigarettes sent him to Congress in season 3. He is exactly the kind of person the system is designed to reward. He looks the part. He has no hidden agenda complicating his delivery. He says what he is told to say with total conviction because he does not have enough distance from what he is saying to question it. He is relatable in a way that more calculated people are not, because the relatable quality is completely genuine. Peter is not performing sincerity. He is just sincere, even when what he is being sincere about is wrong. The white hair detail is central to this. Peter did not earn authority. He did not gain experience or wisdom. He got locked in a basement and came out looking older,
and that visual cue was enough to change how everyone treated him.
The episode is making a quiet point about how authority is perceived versus how it is earned, and the gap between those two things. The people who trust Peter with his white hair are not stupid. They are responding to a signal that has always meant something in the culture: gray hair, age, experience. The signal is real. In Peter's case, it just happens to be completely disconnected from any actual substance behind it. This is the setup that makes the Trump two-parter work as something more than a collection of political jokes. Hefty Shades of Grey establishes that Peter's path to the White House is not absurd or accidental. It is logical. Given how the fake news ecosystem operates, given what it rewards, given the gap between looking authoritative and being authoritative, a man like Peter ending up as White House press secretary is not a stretch. It is the natural endpoint of a sequence of reasonable seeming steps, each of which made sense in the moment. The ghost hunting subplot at the start of the episode is worth noting because of what it does to Peter before the main story begins. He is not presented as powerful or confident at the start of the episode. He is presented as someone his own friends abandon in the dark. Meg, who is usually the family's punching bag, has the power to help him and chooses not to. Peter starts the episode at the bottom of his own social hierarchy, locked in a basement, screaming into the dark. He ends it being offered a job by the President of the United States. The distance between those 2 points is enormous, and Hefty Shades of Grey covers that distance in a single episode. The episode ends with Lois standing there holding Peter's detached head. His body is still upright. Peter, from somewhere, quips that this is just what Washington needs. His head gets put back. The to be continued card appears. It is a cliffhanger,
but not a dramatic one in the way television cliffhangers usually work. Nobody is in danger. Nothing terrible has happened yet. The cliffhanger is simply the knowledge that the Griffins are about to move into the Trump White House, and that whatever is about to happen will be more chaotic, louder, and harder to clean up than anything a single episode of fake news punditry could produce. The setup is complete. The pieces are in place. Peter has the white hair, the credibility he did not earn, the job he does not fully understand, and the family he is dragging along behind him into a situation none of them asked for. Brian is furious. Lois has literally just lost her head over this. Meg has no opinion that anyone will listen to. Chris and Stewie are going to Washington. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Everything that Hefty Shades of Grey built carefully and quietly, the episode that followed it was about to detonate. Section 7, Trump Guy, Season 17, Episode 11, 2019. There's a scene about halfway through this episode where Meg Griffin tries to tell her family that the President of the United States just grabbed her inappropriately. She is shaking. She is clearly telling the truth. Her mother Lois looks at her and says out loud, "Meg, you expect us to believe that the President of the United States would grab a woman by her privates?" Peter does not believe her either. Nobody in the room believes her. The family dismisses what she is saying and moves on. Meg is left standing there, having just been assaulted by the most powerful person in the country, with nobody willing to take her word for it. That scene is not played for laughs. It is one of the few moments in the entire episode where the comedy stops completely, and the show just lets the thing it is saying sit in the room without a punchline underneath it. The episode is called Trump Guy, and it aired on January 13th, 2019, as the 11th episode of Family Guy's 17th season and the direct follow-up to Hefty Shades of Grey. It was written by Patrick Meighan and directed by Joe Vox. It is the 320th episode of Family Guy overall. The episode drew an audience of 4.04 million viewers on its original airing, which was the lowest number in its time slot that night, but still made it the third most watched show on Fox, behind only The Simpsons and Bob's Burgers. Critics largely did not like it. Audiences were divided. It remains one of the most discussed episodes in the show's later seasons, for reasons that go beyond whether or not specific jokes landed. The episode begins where Hefty Shades of Grey ended. The Griffin family arrives in Washington, D.C. on the presidential helicopter. Trump lands on the Griffin family's front lawn to
collect them personally. The family boards the helicopter and flies to the White House. Peter walks the halls of the building with Trump and is shown around. Meg is introduced to Ivanka Trump, who takes a liking to her and gives her a makeover, turning her into someone Washington considers attractive and well-dressed. Meg is genuinely happy about this. It is one of the few times in the entire run of the show that Meg gets to feel good about herself, even briefly. Then, Ivanka leaves Meg alone with her father. What happens next in the episode is a direct reference to something Donald Trump said on a recording that became public during the 2016 presidential campaign. In 2005, Trump was recorded on a bus before an entertainment television appearance saying, among other things, that when you are famous, you can grab women by a specific part of their body and they let you do it. That recording was released to the public in October 2016, weeks before the election. It caused enormous controversy. Trump called it locker room talk and said it did not reflect his actual behavior. The Family Guy episode takes that statement and builds a running sequence around it.
Trump grabs Meg exactly where he described on that recording. Meg tries to tell her family. Nobody believes her. The writers of the episode spoke publicly about their decision to include this storyline. They said they wanted to address this aspect of Trump's public record without putting Meg in too compromised a position. The Jabba the Hutt scene, where Trump transforms visually into the massive alien crime lord from Star Wars when he tries to assault Meg a second time, was their way of making the sequence unmistakably clear without being gratuitous. Mike Pence, Trump's vice president, is shown sitting next to him during this moment, styled to look exactly like Salacious Crumb, the small, cackling creature that sits beside Jabba the Hutt in the Star Wars films. The visual is specific and deliberate. The writers did not stumble into that comparison accidentally. The second assault attempt is what changes everything. The rest of the Griffin family walks in and catches Trump in the act. This time, there is no dismissing Meg. Peter sees it with his own eyes. He quits the job immediately. He announces he is going to be a better person, a kinder man, someone who thinks before he acts and treats people with decency. This lasts approximately as long as it takes for Trump to call him a failed role model. Trump tells Peter, to his face, that Peter Griffin has spent 17 years making a television show that normalized offensive behavior, made fun of vulnerable people, and taught audiences that cruelty is funny. He says Peter has no right to claim the moral high ground. Peter's response is that there is a difference between a cartoon and the President of the United States. A cartoon, Peter says, can be turned off. The President cannot. This exchange is the most genuinely interesting moment in the episode, and possibly one of the most honest things Family Guy ever said about itself. Trump is not wrong in his criticism. Peter is not wrong in his response. The show puts both arguments on screen and does not declare a winner, which is unusual for an episode that spends most of its runtime attacking one side very directly. This is the moment critics pointed to when they wrote about the episode being confused or inconsistent. The show attacks Trump relentlessly for 22 minutes and then pauses to have Trump make a valid point about the show itself. Executive producer Rich Apple said in interviews that this self-awareness was intentional. The show understood that it could not spend 17 seasons doing what it had been doing and then position itself as a moral authority without acknowledging the contradiction. Trump pointing at Family Guy and saying, "You are part of this too," is the show preempting the criticism it knew was coming. What follows the argument is the episode's most visually ambitious sequence. Peter and Trump begin fighting. The fight moves through the White House, out onto the lawn, across Washington, D.C., into the Smithsonian Institution's Air and Space Museum, where they each steal a historical airplane. They fly the planes at each other. The planes collide head-on and end up balanced on top of the Washington Monument. Peter and Trump are hanging off the top of the monument. Trump reaches down to grab Peter's hand and pull him to safety. Peter reaches up, but cannot grab on because, as the episode makes explicit, Trump's hands are too small. The hand size joke is one that had been in circulation since Trump's campaign. During the Republican primary debates in 2016, Trump had responded to a suggestion about his hand size by assuring the audience that other parts of his body were not small. The joke became a recurring reference in political comedy for years afterward. Family Guy uses it as the reason Peter almost dies, not because of anything dramatic or political, but because of a physical characteristic that had become one of the defining punchlines of the Trump presidency. Both Peter and Trump fall from the Washington Monument. They land on an industrial air mattress that has been set up on the ground below them. Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, is holding the air mattress. He checks that they are both okay, says it has been great stopping by, mentions he needs to grab his purse, and leaves. The Canadian Prime Minister saves the American president and a cartoon man from Rhode Island, says almost nothing, and departs. This is the complete Trudeau appearance in the episode. He has no further role. The joke is that the resolution to an American catastrophe comes from
from a polite Canadian who treats the whole thing as a minor errand. Peter and Trump reconcile after landing. The fight is over. They watch the sunset together. This is another moment where the episode does something unexpected. After 20 minutes of sustained attack on the Trump administration, the episode ends with Peter and Trump having a moment of genuine peace with each other. Not agreement, not endorsement. Just two people who had a fight and then stopped fighting. The show does not know how to end on pure anger. It never has. Family Guy's DNA runs toward resolution even when the resolution feels slightly unearned. The final scene is the Griffins back home, breaking the fourth wall. Each family member addresses the audience directly. Chris tells viewers that if they want to learn more about the president, they should read the Steele dossier, which he describes as being all about getting urinated on. Stewie tells the audience, in a serious voice, that Trump endorsed someone credibly accused of inappropriate behavior with teenage girls in an Alabama Senate race, and that this fact did not fit into the episode's story, but should not be forgotten. Meg says she is a proud hat owner. Peter tells Meg to shut up. The episode ends. Trump in this episode is voiced by Josh Robert Thompson, a voice actor and impressionist. This was the first episode of Family Guy that was entirely focused on Trump as a character, though the show had made references to him in cutaway gags and background jokes for years before this. The episode had been advertised heavily before it aired, with Fox promoting it as the show's major statement on the Trump administration. The production timeline meant it was written and animated during 2018 and aired in January 2019, roughly 2 years into Trump's presidency. The fight sequence with the stolen Smithsonian airplanes is worth examining specifically because of where it takes place. The Smithsonian Institution is a real collection of museums and research centers in Washington, D.C., most of which are located along the National Mall. The Air and Space Museum holds actual historical aircraft, including planes from both world wars and early space capsules. Family Guy sends Peter and Trump into this building, has them steal planes from it, and crashes those planes into the Washington Monument. The show is not being subtle about its willingness to use American landmarks as props in a brawl. The Washington Monument has now been pointed at as a phallic shape in PTV and crashed into in Trump Guy. No monument in the Family Guy universe is safe. The episode received negative reviews from several critics who felt it was too blunt in its political messaging and not funny enough to justify its running time. Audience reaction on IMDb landed at a 5.8 out of 10, which is low even for later era Family Guy. Some viewers felt the Trump characterization gave him qualities he did not have in real life, including physical agility and the ability to form coherent sentences during a brawl. Others felt the show abandoned its comedy instincts in favor of making political points as loudly as possible. The criticism that the chicken fight format, usually reserved for Peter and his recurring enemy Ernie the Giant Chicken, felt overused by this point was widespread. This was the second time Peter had used that format with someone other than Ernie, the first being his fight with Homer Simpson in the crossover episode with The Simpsons. What the episode accomplished, regardless of its critical reception, was something none of the previous Washington episodes had done. It put the Griffin family inside the White House as residents, not visitors. It made the political conflict personal by targeting Meg specifically. It had the President of the United States and a cartoon man fight across the actual geography of Washington, D.C., and survive only because a foreign leader happened to have an air mattress. And it ended with the show explicitly telling its audience things that did not fit into the episode's story, but should not be forgotten. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Family Guy had been attacking Washington since season 3. Trump Guy was the loudest that attack had ever been. But the show's relationship with Washington was not only built from full episodes and extended fight sequences. Some of the most revealing moments in that relationship happened in single cutaway gags, background jokes, and offhand presidential references that appeared and disappeared without ceremony. And those smaller moments, taken together, build a picture of Washington that is just as complete as anything the show ever devoted a full episode to. Section 8. The recurring presidential cutaway tradition. There is a cutaway gag in Trump Guy where the show briefly pauses the main story to show a series of portraits of American presidents hanging on a White House wall. Each president delivers a short voiceover of a letter they are writing to their wife. George Washington writes to Martha about wanting to place his hands on her gates of Venus. Harry Truman writes to his wife Bess that tonight he is going to drop the big one on her Pacific Theater. George H.W. Bush writes to Barbara that he is working late, sleeping in the office, has a crazy headache, and that she looks like his mom. The sequence lasts maybe 20 seconds. It is not the main joke of the episode. It is not even the main joke of the scene. It is a cutaway within a larger story about Trump, tucked in between more prominent gags, and it covers the entire history history of the American presidency in 3 jokes about intimate letters. That is the presidential cutaway tradition in Family Guy in its purest form. Fast, specific, completely willing to reduce the office of the president to a punchline and move on before you have fully processed what just happened. This section is about all the times Family Guy attacked Washington without devoting a full episode to it. The cutaway gags, the background jokes, the single-scene presidential appearances, and the offhand references that have accumulated across more than 2 decades of the show. Individually, none of these moments carries the weight of an entire episode. Taken together, they build something just as revealing, a portrait of how Family Guy thinks about the presidency and Washington as a permanent fixture of American life, not just as a target to aim at when the writers feel like making a political point. The show's relationship with sitting and former presidents through cutaway gags goes back to some of its earliest seasons. In Mr. Griffin Goes to Washington, which aired in 2001, a cutaway shows Peter giving false testimony at the 1991 Senate confirmation hearings of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. This is a reference to a real historical event. Thomas's confirmation hearings were notable and controversial for reasons the show does not need to spell out. Peter simply appears in the hearing room, says something absurd, and the cutaway ends. The joke requires the audience to know enough about the Thomas hearings to recognize the setting. The show assumes they do. Bob Dole appears in the same episode as a senator who endorses Peter's tobacco campaign and then falls asleep mid-sentence, repeating his own name over and over until he collapses. Bob Dole was the Republican candidate for president in 1996 and was known during his political career for occasionally referring to himself in the third person. The joke takes that real characteristic and pushes it to the point where it becomes a physical malfunction. Bob Dole says Bob Dole one too many times and simply stops functioning. The scene is brief. It does not need to be longer. It establishes the show's template for how it handles real political figures in minor appearances. Take one real known quality, amplify it until it breaks in the scene. George W. Bush appears in the background of a scene in Mr. Griffin Goes to Washington as part of a moment involving a prediction about the 2000 presidential election. Seth MacFarlane confirmed on the DVD commentary for that season that the scene was originally written to predict a Gore victory because the writers genuinely did not believe Bush could win. The episode aired in July 2001, 7 months after the election result, which meant the background joke about the election outcome had already been made incorrect by real events before anyone saw it on television. McFarlane's exact words on the commentary were that they never thought Bush could actually win. The episode went out anyway, with the Bush reference intact, as a small, preserved artifact of what the Family Guy writers believed was going to happen. The show's treatment of Barack Obama across his 2 terms in office is scattered and generally mild compared to how it handled both Bush and Trump. The Obama monument joke in The Splendid Source, which aired in 2010, is the most visually prominent Obama reference in any full episode. But Obama also appears in the background of jokes and references across seasons 9 through 16, which covered most of his presidency. In the episode You Can't Handle the Booth, which aired during season 17 and was structured as the Griffin family recording DVD commentary for a random episode of their own show, Stewie mentions in passing that he saw Lois vote for Trump when she carried him into the voting booth with her. Brian immediately questions whether this is true. Stewie says honestly he is not sure because he was not paying attention, being too busy with calls on his toy phone. The joke about Lois possibly having voted for Trump is planted and never resolved. The show does not confirm or deny it. It simply leaves the possibility sitting there. The episode Regarding Carter, which aired in season 15, contains a moment where Cleveland does a stand-up comedy routine that includes a reference to Trump calling off an investigation into Russian interference in the election that made him president. This aired before the Trump two-parter, which means the show was making specific political references to Trump's behavior as president in passing moments before it committed to a full episode about him. The background references were building up across multiple seasons before Trump Guy finally addressed the subject directly. In the episode American Gigolo, a cutaway shows the actual Access Hollywood recording from 2005 in which Trump made the comments about grabbing women. The cutaway appears without extended setup or commentary. The recording existed. It was public. The show referenced it in passing, the way it references any piece of existing cultural material, quickly, in a cutaway, and then out. The same recording would later become the direct source for the Meg assault storyline in Trump Guy, but the show had already flagged it in a much smaller way before the full episode arrived. The episode Must Love Dogs, which aired later in the show's run, contains a Halloween scene where Joe Swanson dresses as Donald Trump and Herbert the Pervert. The show's recurring elderly character who is coded as a predator dresses as Jeffrey Epstein. The two characters are shown together at a Halloween party. The visual pairing of those two costumes is the joke. The show does not explain it. The audience either knows who Jeffrey Epstein was was and what he was accused of, in which case the joke lands, or they do not, in which case it is just 2 Halloween costumes. The show is comfortable making jokes that only fully register for people paying attention to certain things. La Familia Guy, which aired in 2020, contains a moment where Peter reads a newspaper with a headline reporting that Trump was arrested and hanged himself in jail. A caption appears on screen noting that this episode was written in 2019, before any of that happened, presenting it as a prediction rather than a comment on actual events. The show frames its own dark joke about a sitting president dying in prison as a forecast that it is making clear it produced before anything had actually developed legally. It is a preemptive disclaimer attached to a joke about presidential death. The episode Cutaway Land, which takes the show's format of cutaway gags and makes the format itself the subject, contains a sequence where the Griffin family cuts away into a scene with Trump running an evil empire. Peter, trying to get sent to a different cutaway involving Adolf Hitler, asks Trump who he is always being compared to. Trump says Jesus Christ. This sends them into a cutaway in heaven where Jesus assures Trump he is not dead. Trump, concerned, asks Jesus why he is there if he is alive. Jesus tells him he is fine. The joke works on several levels. The comparison between Trump and Jesus is one that Trump supporters had made publicly and that critics had mocked extensively. The show uses it as a navigation device inside a meta joke about how its own cutaway format works. The episode Adam West High, which aired in season 17 and involved Brian running against Quagmire for mayor of Quahog, contains a moment where Brian describes the character James Woods as a political troll and a maniac on Twitter. The description is clearly meant to apply to Trump rather than to the actual actor James Woods, who is a recurring character on Family Guy. The joke uses James Woods as a stand-in because the show is making a Trump reference in an episode that is not about Trump, and using the stand-in gives it distance from the direct comparison while making the reference unmistakable to anyone watching. The series of presidential cutaways and background references across the show's run creates a consistent picture of how Family Guy treats the presidency as an institution. Presidents in full episodes get fought, outwitted, or survived. Presidents in cutaways and background references get reduced to single characteristics and made to demonstrate those characteristics until the joke is done. Washington as a physical place appears in background shots, gets its monuments compared to body parts, gets fictional monuments added to its skyline, and has its landmarks used as stages for brawls. The show has never treated the White House or the presidency with reverence. Not in season 3, not in season 6, not in season 16, not in season 17. What makes the cutaway tradition specifically interesting is what it says about how the show processes political reality in real time. The full episodes, the 2 trips to Congress, the Stewie takeover, the Trump two-parter, take years to develop and produce. By the time they air, the political moment that inspired them has often moved on. The cutaway gags are faster. They can reference something that happened recently without needing to build a whole story around it. The Access Hollywood tape appeared in a cutaway gag. The Russian investigation appeared in a Cleveland stand-up bit. The Steele dossier got referenced in the Trump guy closing scene. These are not throwaway moments. They are the show processing current events in the only form fast enough to keep up with them. The Oval Office, across all of these appearances and references, is never treated as sacred. It is a room where Stewie sat and issued grammar laws. It is a room where a portrait series of presidents writing inappropriate letters is used as a 20-second cutaway. It is a room where Peter walked in as press secretary and immediately started making things worse. The building is real. The history in it is real. Family Guy has spent more than 2 decades insisting that none of that makes it untouchable. All of these smaller moments, the cutaways, the background references, the single scene appearances, share something with the full episodes that came before them. They are built on the same argument that power in Washington presents itself as serious, important, and beyond questioning, and that the correct response to that presentation is to keep questioning it anyway, in as many formats and as many jokes as the show can fit across 20+ seasons. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But Family Guy's attacks on Washington were never purely about policy or politics. They were also about something more personal, the specific worldview of the man who created the show and the people who wrote for it, and how that worldview shaped every version of Peter, Stewie, Lois, and Brian that ever set foot in the nation's capital. Understanding those attacks fully means understanding who was making them, why they felt the need to make them on a Fox network show, and what they thought they were actually accomplishing by doing so. Section 9. Seth MacFarlane's personal politics and how they shape the attacks. There is a line in Trump Guy where Brian Griffin, the family dog, confronts Donald Trump directly and calls him an internationally notorious criminal, a disgusting and shamelessly offensive person, and someone who is single-handedly ruining everything great about the country. The line is delivered fast, the way Brian delivers most of his political opinions, with total confidence and zero room for debate. Peter, standing next to him, seems mildly embarrassed by the force of it. Trump does not flinch. The scene lasts about 15 seconds. It is one of the most direct things Family Guy has ever said about a sitting president, and it comes out of Brian's mouth, which is significant because Brian Griffin is, across the entire run of the show, the character most consistently used to express the political and cultural opinions of the people writing him. Brian is not Seth MacFarlane. He is a cartoon dog. But across 20-plus seasons, Brian has functioned as the character closest to the show's actual point of view, the one most likely to say what the writers genuinely think, the one whose frustrations with Peter and with the world tend to mirror the frustrations of educated, left-leaning people watching a country they feel is going in the wrong direction. Understanding why Family Guy's attacks on Washington look the way they look requires understanding who Seth MacFarlane is, what he believes, and how those beliefs have shaped everything from the choice of targets to the specific way the jokes land. Seth MacFarlane created Family Guy and has been its primary voice, showrunner, and public face since the show premiered in 1999. He voices 4 of the show's main characters: Peter Griffin, Brian Griffin, Stewie Griffin, and Glenn Quagmire. The fact that he voices both Peter and Brian, characters who represent opposite ends of the show's political and intellectual spectrum, is not a coincidence. MacFarlane has said in interviews that he considers both characters to express real parts of his own personality. Peter is the impulsive, instinct-driven part. Brian is the part that reads the news, forms opinions, and gets frustrated when other people do not share them. MacFarlane's political views have never been a secret. He has described himself as a liberal and a humanist. He has been publicly critical of religion in multiple interviews and has used both Family Guy and his other shows, American Dad and The Orville, to express skepticism about organized religion and social conservatism. He has spoken out on gun control, environmental issues, and LGBTQ rights. He hosted the Academy Awards in 2013 and received significant criticism for several jokes that many felt were offensive. He has also been criticized from the left for jokes in Family Guy that have targeted women, gay people, and other groups in ways that some audiences felt were harmful. His response to this criticism has generally been that comedy is a space where all subjects are available and that the intent behind a joke matters as much as its content. The specific detail that shapes the Washington attacks most directly is MacFarlane's relationship with Fox News and the Fox network. Family Guy airs on Fox. It has aired on Fox since 1999, with the exception of the cancellation period between 2002 and 2005. Fox also owns Fox News, the cable news channel that MacFarlane has been publicly and repeatedly critical of. In late 2018, shortly before the Trump two-parter aired, MacFarlane called Fox News incredibly destructive in a public statement. He said he was glad he had never met Roger Ailes, the man who built Fox News and who died in 2017 after being removed from the network following multiple accusations of sexual misconduct. The statement was notable because MacFarlane was criticizing a division of the same company that was paying him to make Family Guy. This tension, making a show for a network while publicly attacking another part of that network, is something MacFarlane has navigated for years. The PTV episode, which aired in 2005 and attacked government censorship and the Parents Television Council, was made and broadcast on Fox. The Trump two-parter, which spent 2 episodes attacking the president that Fox News supported loudly and consistently, aired on Fox. The show has always existed inside this contradiction, and MacFarlane has never seemed particularly troubled by it. In interviews, he has suggested that the creative freedom Fox gives its animated shows is genuine, and that the network's willingness to let Family Guy say what it wants to say is separate from the channel's news division's editorial positions. Alex Sulkin, who became a showrunner on Family Guy and co-wrote several of the show's most politically direct episodes, including PTV, has been a consistent voice in interviews about how the show approaches political material. When Trump Guy aired, Sulkin spoke to TV Line about the timeline of how the episode was written and produced, and about how Trump's consistency as a public figure made the satire work even with a long gap between writing and airing. His observation that Trump was always in the news for doing the same things is a political statement dressed up as a production note. The subtext is that Trump's behavior was so reliable in its patterns that you could write jokes about it a year in advance and they would still be accurate when they reached audiences. Patrick Meighan, who wrote Trump Guy specifically, has spoken spoken about the decision to include the sexual assault storyline involving Meg. The writers wanted to address what the Access Hollywood recording revealed about Trump's self-described behavior without making the scene something audiences could easily laugh off. Putting Meg in that position, Meg, who is the family member most consistently treated poorly by everyone around her, including her own parents, was a deliberate choice. When Lois tells Meg that she does not believe her, the show is not making a joke about Lois being foolish. It is making an observation about how women who report assault are received,
regardless of who the person being accused is. The fact that Lois changes her mind the moment she sees it with her own eyes adds a layer to that observation that the show does not spell out but does not need to. The self-criticism in Trump Guy, where Trump points at Family Guy and argues that the show has spent 17 years normalizing offensive behavior and teaching audiences that cruelty is funny, is the most direct acknowledgement the show has ever made of its own contradictions. McFarland has been asked about this dynamic in interviews for years. Critics from both sides have argued about whether Family Guy's offensive jokes cause harm or simply reflect a world that already contains that harm. McFarland's position has generally been that comedy is not the same as endorsement, and that laughing at something is not the same as agreeing with it. But Trump Guy goes further than any previous episode by putting the counterargument in the mouth of its villain, and then having Peter respond with something that is not quite a refutation. Peter does not prove Trump wrong. He just argues that the scale of responsibility is different. A cartoon is optional. A president is not. This moment is where McFarland's politics and his creative instincts intersect most visibly. He believes in free speech strongly enough to have made an entire episode defending it against government censorship. He also believes that people in positions of power have obligations that private citizens do not. The difference he draws, through Peter, between a cartoon that can be turned off and a president who cannot be, is not a fully worked out philosophical argument. It is a gut feeling about responsibility and scale, expressed through a character who does not typically make precise philosophical arguments. It is Peter Griffin's version of an ethics position, which means it is rough and incomplete, but also, underneath the roughness, genuinely felt. McFarland has also spoken about the show's cancellation history in ways that are relevant here. Family Guy was canceled by Fox in 2002 after 3 seasons and low ratings. It was brought back in 2005 after strong DVD sales and high viewership in reruns on the Cartoon Network. The cancellation and revival are part of the show's mythology, and McFarland has referenced the experience as something that taught him about the relationship between creative work and commercial survival. The show came back because audiences sought it out when the network stopped showing it. That experience appears to have given McFarland a certain confidence about the show's durability that influences how far he is willing to push its political content. He has already survived a cancellation. The network has already proven it cannot simply make the show disappear when it becomes inconvenient. The Mr. Griffin Goes to Washington episode, which was the show's first real Washington attack, aired during the Bush administration. It targeted corporate lobbying and the tobacco industry rather than the president directly. McFarland's instinct at that stage was to use Peter's stupidity as the satirical vehicle rather than attacking political figures by name. By the time PTV aired in 2005, also during the Bush years, the show had become more confident in directing its political energy at specific institutions, the FCC, the Parents Television Council, Congress, but was still filtering the attack through comedy premises rather than direct statements. The Trump era changed this. Trump Guy is the first episode of Family Guy where a sitting president is the explicit villain of the story, depicted assaulting a family member on screen, fighting the main character through the streets of Washington, and being named and characterized without much comedic distance between the show and its target. The reason this shift happened is not complicated. McFarland said publicly that he was disturbed by the Trump presidency in a way that previous administrations had not disturbed him. His criticism of George W. Bush, which existed in the show across seasons 3 through 7, was expressed through jokes and background references. His criticism of Trump generated 2 full episodes, a running series of cutaway references across multiple seasons, and a public statement calling the news channel on his own network incredibly destructive. The emotional register of the Trump-era material is different from anything that came before it. It is angrier. It is less interested in finding the comedy in the situation, and more interested in making a record of what the show thought about the situation while it was happening. That shift in register is something audiences noticed when Trump Guy aired. Some viewers felt the show had abandoned its comedy for politics. Others felt it had finally said something true. Both reactions are, in their own way, correct. The show had moved from using Washington as a comedy setting to using it as a target. The difference is not always visible from outside, but you can feel it in the writing. Mr. Griffin Goes to Washington finds Peter funny because of his accidental competence.
incompetence. Trump guy finds the White House frightening because of the competence it is supposed to have and does not. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The politics behind Family Guy's attacks on Washington were never hidden. They were just wearing a cartoon. And now that we have looked at who was making those attacks and why, there is one final question worth asking. Across all of it, the tobacco lobby, the FCC battle, the baby world domination, the road trip past a new monument, the Michael Bay War Council, the fake news arc, the brawl across the Washington Monument,
and 20 years of cutaway gags about sitting presidents.
What is Family Guy actually saying about power?
Not about specific politicians or specific policies,
but about the nature of Washington itself. The answer has been sitting in plain sight since season 3, and it turns out every episode in this video has been building toward the same point from a different direction. Section 10. What the White House attacks reveal about Family Guy's theory of power. There is a pattern that runs through every single Washington episode in this video, and it is so consistent that once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Peter Griffin goes to Congress to fight for the tobacco industry and accidentally destroys it instead. The FCC cracks down on indecency and gets defeated by a joke about building shapes. Stewie Griffin hacks the CIA, seizes the planet's power grid, becomes president of the world, and loses because his own mother crashes through a window. A road trip to Washington adds a new monument to the National Mall and keeps driving. The White House holds a war council and concludes that the only solution to a global threat is a man from Rhode Island who throws beer kegs. A fake news pundit becomes press secretary because the president liked his lies. The press secretary fights the president across the Capitol and survives because a Canadian showed up with an air mattress. In every single one of these stories, Washington looks powerful at the start and is revealed to be something much stranger by the end. Not evil, exactly. Not corrupt in a simple, cartoonish way. Just deeply, structurally, almost comically dependent on the wrong things working in the right order. The show's argument, made across more than 2 decades and more than a dozen episodes and cutaway gags, is not that Washington is run by bad people. It is that Washington is run by a system that rewards the wrong qualities and punishes the right ones.
And that this has been true for long enough that nobody inside the system notices it anymore. Peter proves this in season 3 without meaning to. He does not go to Washington to expose the tobacco industry. He goes to Washington to protect it. He changes his mind not because of a political awakening or a principled stand, but because he looks up and sees Stewie coughing. The system is defeated by love and bad timing. The tobacco company picked Peter because he was too simple to have an agenda. That same simplicity is what makes him impossible to fully control. You cannot account for a man who will genuinely change his position the moment something real happens in front of him. Washington, as Family Guy understands it, is built for people who do not change their positions when something real happens. Peter is the variable the system forgot to plan for. PTV makes the same argument from a different angle. The FCC is not portrayed as evil in that episode. It is portrayed as an institution that has given itself permission to define decency for everyone else, which is a different kind of problem. The show's response to that problem is not a legal argument or a protest march. It is Peter pointing at a building and saying, "It looks like a specific body part." Congress has no response to this because there is no dignified response to it. The Washington Monument has looked the way it looks for over 100 years. Every single person who has ever worked in that building has walked past it. The joke works because the institution has collectively decided not to notice something that is obviously true, and all it takes is one person saying it out loud to make the collective decision collapse. Family Guy's theory of power includes the idea that a lot of what holds powerful institutions together is a shared agreement not to point at certain things. Peter has never been capable of that agreement. Stewie's takeover in the season 6 two-parter adds another layer. Stewie does not take over the world by fighting the system. He takes over the world by going around it. He walks into the CIA dressed as an agent, sits down at a computer, and does what he came to do. The system's security depends on people behaving in expected ways, wearing expected outfits, saying expected things. A baby in a suit who knows how computers work is not something the CIA's procedures were built to handle. The White House becomes his base of operations, not because he conquered it, but because once you control the power grid, the White House is just where you go to make announcements. The building is a symbol. Stewie understands this. He uses the symbol because it communicates authority to everyone watching. The actual power was already his before he walked through the door. Then the simulation framing pulls the rug. Stewie ran the numbers. He found out how the takeover would end, with Peter walking in and shooting him in the head while his mother watches. He decided it was not worth it. The show is
not saying that world domination is impossible. It is saying that even the most capable person in the Family Guy universe, the one with the actual intelligence and the actual tools and the actual plan, looks at what winning from the White House looks like and decides to wait. Power at that level costs something the simulation made visible. Stewie files the information away and goes back to his room. The Splendid Source and 3 directors treat Washington with a lighter touch, but make the same underlying observation. The Obama monument in The Splendid Source is funny because of what it says about how legacy works in America, how quickly a new symbol gets placed next to an old one, how the old one suddenly looks smaller by comparison, how nobody in the episode stops to discuss what this means because the road trip is more important. Washington is a backdrop to other things. The Michael Bay White House War Council in 3 Directors is the clearest version of the show's core argument about the building. The most powerful military in the world, assembled in the most important building in the country, concludes that it needs Peter Griffin. The ceremony of the setting and the absurdity of the solution exist in the same frame without any tension. The show has made this point so many times by season 16 that it does not need to underline it. The War Council just happens. Peter gets recruited. The world gets saved by a keg throw. The Trump two-parter is where the theory of power becomes personal in a way none of the earlier episodes quite managed. Hefty Shades of Grey demonstrates that the path to the White House runs through the same mechanisms that made Peter a successful fake news pundit. Looking credible without being credible, saying alarming things with confidence, giving people the feeling that someone is in charge even when nothing has actually changed. The white hair is the joke. The white hair is also the point. Authority in this system is a signal, and signals can be faked, and once they are faked convincingly enough, the system treats them as real. Trump Guy pushes this to its limit. The president in that episode has enough power to offer Peter a job, bring his family to Washington, and make every institution in the Capitol ignore a brawl happening in the middle of the street. Congress watches Peter and Trump fight and cheers for whichever one just landed a punch, alternating sides with each hit. Chris Griffin, watching this from the writer's room in a moment where the show breaks its own format, says out loud that this is why America is so divided. Nobody in Congress stops the fight. Nobody calls for order. The institution designed to govern the country treats a street brawl between the president and a cartoon man as entertainment. This is the furthest the show has ever taken its argument about Washington. And it is stating it as plainly as Family Guy ever states anything. The place designed to make serious decisions has stopped being able to tell the difference between governing and spectacle. The resolution to that fight matters too. Peter and Trump do not get stopped by law enforcement or removed from the monument by the Secret Service. They fall. They land on a mattress held by the Canadian Prime Minister. The American system does not save them. A foreign leader with an air mattress saves them. And then Trudeau leaves because he has other things to do, and Peter and Trump watch the sunset together. The show is not naive enough to think reconciliation is meaningful after everything the episode depicted, but it cannot end on pure anger, because Family Guy has never been able to end on pure anger. Even its most serious episodes find a way back to something warmer. The sunset moment is not earned in any dramatic sense. It is just the show remembering that it is still, underneath everything, a show about a family that keeps coming back to each other. Across all 10 of these stories, from the tobacco lobby in 2001 to the fake news press secretary in 2019, Family Guy has been making the same argument in different costumes. Power in Washington is not what it presents itself as. The building is real. The history is real. The ceremonies and the titles and the monuments are all real. But the thing that actually determines outcomes, again and again in these stories, is not strategy or strength or intelligence. It is the variable the system forgot to account for. In season 3, it is parental love. In season 4, it is a building-shaped joke. In season 6, it is a simulation that shows the cost of winning. In season 8, it is a monument that is taller and painted black. In season 16, it is a man who is good at throwing things. In season 17, it is a Canadian with an air mattress. The variable is always something the system was not built to handle, because the system was built by people who assumed the variables would behave predictably. Peter Griffin has never behaved predictably. Stewie Griffin behaved predictably until he ran the simulation and chose not to. The FCC behaved predictably until someone pointed at the Washington Monument. Washington, in Family Guy's version of it, is a place that keeps meeting people and situations it was not designed for, and keeps being surprised by this, and keeps losing to it. That is not a revolutionary political statement. It is not a detailed policy argument or a specific call call for change. It is something simpler and in some ways more durable. It is a cartoon that has spent more than 20 years insisting that the people and institutions that present themselves as the most serious, the most powerful, and the most in control are the ones most vulnerable to a man who does not know he should be intimidated. Peter is never intimidated by Washington. He is impressed by it sometimes, confused by it often, but never intimidated. And in Family Guy's world, that lack of intimidation turns out to be the most powerful thing anyone ever brings into the building. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.